Now, the title of the book, The Caretakers of the Cosmos. I started the book by saying it's a bold title. And when someone asked me while I was working on the book, what was it about? I said, basically, I have to write the book to explain what the title means. And the idea is that human beings, us in this room, and not just us, but let's be very liberal, other people outside as well, but us especially, because you turned up tonight. We all have a profound responsibility in existence, in the cosmos itself. And that idea came to me while I was working on an earlier book called The Quest for Hermes Trismegistus, which is a story of this mythological, more or less, figure that's the founder of Hermeticism, the ancient god of magic, who was given this revelation at the dawn of time, the secret knowledge, the ancient teachings. And in the context of the Hermetic books, the Corpus Trismegistus and his disciples, or Hermes Trismegistus and Nous, the universal mind. Trismegistus, by the way, means 3 times great. He was great, 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 Hermes. He's sort of a combination of Thoth, who's looking up to us, and the Greek god Hermes. This happened in Alexandria in the Greco-Egyptian period, with the Ptolemaic dynasties. They kind of came together. But in any case, in these exchanges in the Corpus Hermeticum, Hermes is informed by the universal mind, Nous, that man is a dual being. Man is a being of 2 natures. There's one nature is of the earth, is earthly, is a thing like other things, is subject to all the laws and limitations and constraints about being in the physical form, living in the material world, time and space. But there's another part of man, or human beings. You won't mind if I say man, because I use it in the old sense of meaning, like in the German Mensch, which means humanity itself, not male, or just men. So if you allow me that freedom to do that, that man has another nature as well, a spiritual one that comes from the stars, between spot, a kind of transition point between these 2 worlds. And that's why in the Hermetic tradition, man is considered a microcosm, sort of miniature cosmos, reflection of the greater cosmos. Man, in one sense, is a thing like other things. This is the way man is seen today, mostly in scientific terms, and pretty much cultural ones as well. We don't have any particular place in the cosmos. That used to be the case at an earlier time. There was a sense we call the crown of creation, an earlier Western civilization. That was, the Judeo-Christian philosophy saw man as having a particular place in the world. But in the modern time, we've jettisoned that sense. But this idea of man having these 2 natures is explained in the sense that with his higher spiritual nature, we can love the higher things, the things of the heaven, take care of the things of the earth. We can care for them. And I saw that this idea comes up in other philosophies as well. It appears in Kabbalah, especially in the Lurianic Kabbalah of Itzhak Luria. I did a revision on the Kabbalah at the time. Now, tradition says Kabbalah goes back just as far, pretty much, as the Hermetic tradition does, at the dawn of time. But we can peg it more accurately, at least in historical sense, till about the 12th century in Spain, where there were earlier traditions, but they begin to be codified then. And Itzhak becomes a student of Kabbalah. But there's certain questions that are troubling. Like, how did God, who's an infinite being, create a finite world? How did God, who's supposed to be all loving, create a world full of pain and suffering? And various other conundrums that, most of us, if we have any sense, we're still gnawing away at now. But in order to answer these troubling questions, Itzhak came up with a peculiar notion of how God created the world. And he said that God created the world through this process that he called Zimtzum, which is a contraction, a pulling away, a receding. And if you imagine God as this kind of very thin, ethereal substance pervading everywhere, it is everywhere. Not only in the sense that it is there, that in the sense of identity. At some point, God started to pull away bits of himself, or herself, or itself. And you can kind of, in a way, you can sort of see creases in reality, sort of ontological creases, and this whole emerging in God. And it's within this hole, this empty space, that our universe exists. Because it was only in the absence of God that God could create something. But when he does it, he, she, or it does it, he screws up. He makes a mess. Doesn't do a very good job. So the two different versions in Kabbalah say more or less the same thing. One is that when God or the divine forces, the Ein Sof, which is not manifest, which is some unmanifest mystical source behind the manifest world, poured its energies into this absence, this hole, this negation of itself in order to create the world. It created the Sephiroth of the tree of life. And the Sephiroth means vessels, cups, bowls in some sense. And one version is that the forces going into the Sephiroth were too powerful, and they were weak, and they fractured, and they shattered, and everything spilled. Another version has it that they weren't deep enough, and the powers overflowed. But in both cases, God makes a mess. Now, Luria proposes a really interesting idea, that in a way God made the mess. He was making a mistake. In a way, God's unconscious. Freud, we can think about Freud, or think about God in a Freudian sense, that God somehow made the mistake on purpose, even though he did it unconsciously, in order to create man, human beings. Because our job, according to Itzhak Luria, is to repair the mess. Our job is to be the Bob the Builders, or the Mr. Fix-Its of the cosmos, for God to come and repair the mess that he made. And we do this through a process called Tikkun, which means repair. And there's a variety of different ways you can do it. There isn't a particular practice, there isn't a particular sort of set of rituals or anything like that. It's a kind of attentiveness. It's the process of filling out what are called kavanot, intentions, being very attentionful towards the world in existence and your actions within it. And this idea again, so you have in the Hermetic tradition, man being a caretaker. In this Kabbalistic tradition, he's a repairman. But the interesting thing about the repair job is that, in the first place, unlike Humpty Dumpty, the world is put back together again. Not all of it at the same time, but in bits and pieces. But not only is it put back together again, it's a better Humpty Dumpty than it was in the first place. This is an interesting thing for Luria. This is why it was God's unconscious that did it. God somehow couldn't directly create a being that would do a better job than he, she, or it did. He sort of had to do it on the slide. He sort of had to not know that he was doing it himself. Sort of the dark side of God, if you want to think of it that way. But again, there's other traditions as well that say this. In the writings of the 18th century French mystic Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, who knew Cagliostro and the Comte de Saint-Germain and other characters from that very dashing time, he said that man's job was to be the repairer of the universe. That we were precisely put into this world in order to repair the mistakes, the rifts, the fractures, the cracks, the fissures that run through existence. And similarly, we do this through some process involving our own consciousness, our own intentions towards things, our own awareness of things. It's not going through certain sets of rituals which, in different religions, you have practices like that. It's not based on that sort of thing. It's based on some kind of alteration in our perception of the world, in our attentiveness to it. Here in other traditions as well. Buddhists, the Bodhisattva, Emmanuel Swedenborg, the great Swedish mystic, basically his message is do the good that you know. Our job is if we see some good that needs doing in the world, it's to do it, whatever that good might be. If we see that it's a good, we have to act it out in some way. And he says that the Lord suffers a stillbirth until we do the good that we know. Somehow creation is incomplete. It's not fully born until we actively engage with it by performing these good deeds in certain ways. And so, again and again in the book, there's different esoteric traditions in which this appears. Now, this struck me as interesting because it's a very different picture than how human beings are seen today, I think. The sort of standard scientific, rational, postmodern cultural sort of view of us. We have no particular importance. We have no particular responsibility in the world. The world itself has no particular importance or responsibility. It's a completely purposeless accident. And so we're told by the brightest minds that are around these days that 15 billion years ago, less than nothing exploded for no reason. And that's why ultimately you and I are here right now, listening to me say I disagree with that. There's absolutely no reason why we exist. There's no reason why the cosmos exists. Forget about us. There's no reason why anything exists. It just does. This is basically what Stephen Hawking said a couple years ago in a book that he put out. We basically argued in the book that God, we don't need a creator to create the universe. I'm not arguing that we do. I take the argument with his conclusion, which basically said it just happened, which we knew already, as far as I was concerned. We didn't need a lot of Stephen Hawking physics to tell us that. But in any case, it happened. We exist, and there's absolutely no reason for it. And within that, human beings have no reason for existing. We're chance products in a purposeless universe. So on that side. And then, very well-intentioned people, concerned for the environment, concerned for nature, concerned for ecology, concerned for all the damage the planet has endured. Basically, many of them see human beings as a blight, as a kind of cancer, as a kind of plague on the earth. And far from being the crown of creation, or far from being any kind of special agent of the deity or the creative energies behind the universe, we're absolutely marauders. The social philosopher John Gray calls us Homo rapiens instead of Homo sapiens. And we more or less feel that this is, right. We feel a mea culpa. We rightly feel guilty and bad for all the damage that we've done to the planet. But at the same time, this sense of guilt, this mea culpa, it can, in a way, allow us to avoid the responsibilities of being caretakers of the cosmos, of being the repairmen, of being co-creators with the agencies at work behind the world. And a book that Colin Wilson, a writer whose work I'm very influenced by, published in the late 1950s, called Here, The Age of Defeat. In the US it was called The Stature of Man. They have a much more upbeat publishing idea in the States at that time. It's analysis of the loss of the hero in modern culture of the time, the late 50s, early 60s. And it's an analysis of this idea that he calls the fallacy of insignificance. That mostly, for the last 50 years at least, or perhaps even more, in different ways, we've been given the message that we absolutely, there's no reason behind us, there's no purpose behind us, and we can't win, basically. We're beaten down by the system, or we're beaten down by the world, and somehow the hero is this outmoded notion, romantic idea of some kind of, creative, successful in an ontological sense, character in the world. And if you know Wilson's work, this is something that he's antithetical to. His whole idea is much more optimistic and positive and forward-looking, and trying to reinvent the notion of the hero, let's say. But one of the people who read Wilson's book was Abraham Maslow, the American psychologist. And he agreed with Wilson that there was a sense of diminished expectations about humans, about ourselves in the world. He talks about, we try to avoid any kind of real urgent responsibility in the world. We don't want to stand out. We don't want to be anything special. We want to be like everybody else. It's kind of the Babbitt complex. We want to fit in. We don't want to accept any kind of unique responsibility and some action, some urge, some call to live creatively in the world. And from reading Maslow, I came across this notion of the fully human that Maslow developed, as opposed to the only human. And again, I think we can say in contemporary culture, contemporary psychology or self-help or psychotherapy, in many ways, we're led to let it all hang out. We're led to tell it all. We're led to confess to everything and to admit that we're only human. We're good enough. Good enough for this, good enough for that. And that's okay. That's enough. We shouldn't burden ourselves with too great expectations. We shouldn't try to achieve things beyond the normal, beyond the mediocre, beyond the immediate, because we won't in many ways. And we can save ourselves the burden of any guilt about this by celebrating the fact that we're only human. Now, Maslow thought this was, complete rubbish, and that neuroses really came from denying your fully humanness, the larger part of you, the more creative, the more evolutionarily moving, advancing part of yourself. And so I thought there was a correlation between this notion of being caretakers of the cosmos and this fully human idea that Maslow had. And then I started to see more links, more connections between things. German phenomenologist Max Scheler who was working in the early part of the 20th century and the 1920s. And he came up with this idea of a hierarchy of values that he felt motivated human beings. And that struck me as interesting because Maslow has a similar sort of things, similar sort of notion of hierarchy of values, but as a psychological framework. So Shaler is talking metaphysically, he's talking about some objective values that exist in the objective world in some way. Maslow is talking about a similar sort of hierarchy or ladder, a kind of hierarchy of needs is what Maslow calls them in the human psyche. And at the top of these is this creative level. Maslow calls it the self-actualization level. When after going through fulfilling your physical needs for food, you need for some place to live, to sleep at night, you need for love, or sex, connection, intimacy, you need for self-esteem, the guys down at the pub, the football team, all recognizing what a great guy you are and you're doing the same for them, and everybody doing it now on social networks. I mean, and he said beyond that, beyond this level, the self-esteem level, is this creative level that sadly not everybody reaches. This is a question that troubled Maslow, and he was preoccupied with it towards the end of his life. This level where all these lower sorts of needs were gratified, this new level of living creatively in some way emerges. So that suggested to me, again, that we somehow, as it's recognized in these esoteric traditions, that we sort of have a inbuilt mission to live creatively in the world, to somehow transform our experience from being dull and mundane and boring and angst-ridden and empty to something more living, something more alive, something more immediate and driven and vital. I saw a correlation between these sorts of things. So it struck me that what these esoteric teachers were talking about in an esoteric sort of way is paralleled by what Maslow was talking about in a psychological way. And is also paralleled in a ontological or metaphysical way by the German philosopher Max Scheler, who talks about a hierarchy of values. It starts out with the physical, much like Maslow. We have to satisfy our hunger. A social one, a one for somehow being respected in the world. But then this level of the sacred, in which we somehow pursue these ultimate and deep questions that have no utilitarian value. They don't help us in life. As far as I'm concerned, all these kind of books about mysticism and Hermeticism that are going to get you on in the world, they're absolutely wrong. It's got nothing to do with that. The treasures and the values and the beauties that you find pursuing these things are not anything that's going to get you on in life. They are values in themselves. You have to get to the level in which you recognize things as values in themselves. When you do that, for Maslow, you're actualizing yourself, and you're also entering this higher level of Shaler's hierarchy of values, the sacred value. And interestingly enough, Scheler is part of a movement in Western philosophy in the early part of the 20th century called philosophical anthropology. And it was precisely developed in order to answer the question, what is man? What is man's place in the cosmos? What is our place in the world? You hear very little about this today, but I'll talk very briefly about some of the people involved in that. There was German philosopher Ernst Cassirer, who again lived until the early 40s, but he was mostly at work in the 20s. And there was a Russian philosopher named Nikolai Berdyaev, who was a fantastic character. He was ex-Marxist Christian existentialist. So he had, quite a few hats on at the same time, went through quite a few things. Both of them had this idea that man's role, we can't explain ourselves in terms of one thing among other things. We can't explain ourselves in terms of being just part of this natural kind of world that the scientific view, or being part of a social world that the sociological world will have it. There's an element in ourselves that exceeds all those things. It stands apart from all of that. It steps outside of that. Scheler makes the point that animals can't say no to existence. They can't say no to the world. It's not that they're saying yes all the time, yay saying like Nietzsche. They just have no capacity to say no. Human beings can step away from the world. We can step outside of things and reflect on it and decide what to do. And we seem to be the only creature so far who can do that. In fact, we have to make an effort to say yes to reality most of the time. But the point I'm making with both of these, and Berdyaev talks about this notion of man. We can't talk of man as being a being of the cosmos. He's in the cosmos, but he's not of the cosmos. There's an old Sufi saying, be in the world but not of it. Rudolf wrote a wonderful book called The Meaning of the Creative Act that came out by, I think, 1913, just before the Russian Revolution, World War I, where he basically expands on that notion at eloquent rhetorical length. But again, his conclusion is our relationship to the world is a creative one. And I'm probably not going to have too much time to be able to win this right now. But what I do in this book and what I do in other books is try to make connections between things. I read a lot and I see, well, this sounds interesting. That seems to connect up with that. I'm not arguing this is the only way to look at these things, but I think there's parallels and resonances between them. And a book that I was very, very excited about recently, in the last couple of years, is called The Master and His Emissary. And it's by a psychologist named Ian McGilchrist. And it's basically a rewriting or a rebooting of the right brain, left brain notion. That was very popular 20 years ago, and then it kind of dropped out precisely because it got too popular with pop psychology and a variety of other people. The neuroscientists doing the hard work decided, well, we can't do that anymore. And anyway, they came to the conclusion that both sides of the brain do the same things anyway. It isn't really the case that the left does all the logical kind of stuff and the right does all the artistic kind of stuff, even though there's a certain tendency or a weight in one way or the other. The basic idea now is that both sides of the brain do exactly the same thing. McGilchrist doesn't deny that. He says it's not what they do, it's how they do it. It's how they do it. Now, the left brain, according to McGilchrist, interacts with the world in this sort of utilitarian, manipulative mostly kind of way. I call it dealing with consciousness. We have a kind of consciousness that deals with the world. I have to make sure that that huge thing hurtling at me, well, it wouldn't be hurtling at me on St. Martin's Lane, but in any case, some other road, there's less traffic, is something I have to get out of the way of. I have to deal with that. I have to deal with a variety of different things in the world. And we need this. This is survival. We can't, we wouldn't be here right now doing this unless we had this kind of consciousness. It's precisely that kind of consciousness that allows us to say no to reality that Shayla talks about. It's precisely the kind of consciousness that can make the world an object, distance itself from it, take it apart, turn it into pieces that it can manipulate and reorganize in order to make its own life better, in order to pursue and fulfill its own values. But we have another kind of consciousness that is the appreciating consciousness. This tends to be what the right brain does. Rather than breaking things up into bits and pieces that it can reorganize and manipulate, it sees things as a kind of whole. It doesn't have the sharp clarity that the left has. It doesn't have the explicitness that the left has. It's all kind of fuzzy and muzzy and nice. That's why we do things like drink alcohol or smoke cannabis or a variety of other things to get into that mode, to put the left to sleep for a while. Because it feels really nice. We're more connected to things. What we lose in the clarity and directness that the left brain has, we gain in a sense of unity, the sense of being one with the world. And McGilchrist says that it's in that other mode that we recognize a kind of participatory relationship that we have with the world. In the left brain, dealing with mode, the world is object. It is other than us. It's something I have to deal with and take care of. But the tree that, say, William Wordsworth sees and recognizes this vibrant, meaningful nature within it, is not the same tree that the farmer sees who's got to chop it down and get out of the way so he can plow the field. It's the same tree, but Wordsworth is experiencing it in a different way. He's experiencing this other mode of consciousness, which is a more participatory mode. It's a mode in which, as we know, the sense of us being one with the thing we're perceiving becomes clear. We feel it. It's difficult to explain it, because when you want to explain it, you have to use the vocabulary and the grammar that the left brain uses to deal with the world. So this is why philosophers like Martin Heidegger write endless long books tying themselves in ontological knots, trying to say something that they can't really say in that language, but we have a sense of what they're trying to say. Wittgenstein took a different route and said, basically, if we can't talk about it, we have to remain silent. But he's still pointing to, he said we can point to it, and that's what art does, that's what poetry does. We have a way of being in this other mode already. We already have it. Art does it, maybe not Tracy Emin, but art in the old style does it. Poetry and all that sort of does it. It's a way of putting ourselves into this more receptive, participatory mode. And it's in that mode that we recognize, as I said, our consciousness is participatory. One of the people I talk about in here in my other books is Owen Barfield, who was a fantastic writer, scholar, thinker and philosopher in the 20th century. He lived throughout most of the 20th century. I think he died, 1997 at 99, something like that. He was a friend with C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. He was part of the Inklings, but he was also a great reader and thinker about the work of Rudolf Steiner. But Barfield on his own developed a notion of participatory consciousness. And I talk about that in the book. I talk about that in some of my other books as well. And he's talking about this way in which our own mind not only interacts with, but is somehow responsible for how we don't create the world, but we represent it. Just like a television set. A television set doesn't create the programs that you watch on it. It receives them. It picks them up. The picture can be cloudy, it can be fuzzy, it can be better, your reception can be rotten, it can be HD, whatever. It doesn't make the programs, but it picks them up. It represents them to you. So what Barfield is saying, and what other people in the book in different ways are saying, people like Steiner, Swedenborg, Uspensky, and other people I talk about a lot of them. There's got to be one of your favorites in there. I guarantee it. They're all talking in different ways about how our own mind participates in the world. And what I say in the book, and I'm not going to be able to say it right now and explain to you fully, is it's through this participatory idea that I say we can actually fulfill the work of taking care of the cosmos. Yes, we can go out and do all the stuff we have to do out in the real world. You know, don't waste so much, recycle, save the forests, all that stuff. We have to take care of the world in that sense. But there's another, more immediate, an epistemological way we have to take care of the world. We have to be able to we have to be able to give what Shayla calls phenomenological love, which should be, you know, an old soul tune or something. You have to be able to somehow direct a kind of attentiveness that isn't out there to grasp and manipulate, but it's a kind of invitation for it to talk to us.